You have 5 minutes to prove you belong here, and everyone in this room already decided you don't. Emily Carter heard the words before she even stepped through the glass doors of Whitmore Global, and for a moment, she wondered if the building itself was warning her to turn around. Rain tapped against the towering windows of the Manhattan skyscraper, the sound blending with the hurried footsteps of executives moving through the marble lobby. Everyone around her looked like they belonged. Tailored suits, expensive watches, confident voices filling the air. Emily looked down at her own reflection in the polished floor. A simple navy blazer she had carefully ironed the night before. A pair of black heels she bought from a discount store 2 years ago. A folder holding the last copy of her resume, the edges slightly worn from being carried to too many interviews. She tightened her grip and reminded herself why she was there. This was not just another interview. This was the chance she had been waiting for. At 26 years old, Emily had learned that life rarely gave people perfect opportunities. Sometimes, you had to walk through intimidating doors while your hands were shaking and hope someone on the other side saw more than your circumstances. The elevator doors opened, revealing the 52nd floor where Whitmore Global's executive offices were located. Emily stepped out quietly, surrounded by people who moved with purpose. A receptionist glanced at her resume folder, then at her simple outfit. The pause was brief, but Emily noticed it. She always noticed. "I'm here for the 10 a.m. interview," Emily said politely. The receptionist checked the schedule. "Emily Carter?" "Yes. Conference room B. Someone will call you shortly." Emily thanked her and walked away, refusing to let the small hesitation follow her. She had spent years learning how to keep moving forward. Years ago, Emily had been on a completely different path. She had graduated near the top of her class, dreamed of building a career in business, and believed hard work could open any door. Then life changed. Responsibilities arrived faster than she expected. Dreams became postponed plans. Plans became survival. But through every difficult season, one thing never changed. Emily never stopped trying. She sat in the waiting area beside 3 other candidates. Their resumes were printed on expensive paper. Their conversations were filled with company names and achievements. One woman mentioned an MBA from a prestigious university. Another talked about connections within the industry. Emily listened quietly. She did not have impressive introductions. She did not have powerful friends. She only had her experience, her determination, and the lessons she had learned when things did not go according to plan. Across the building, behind a wall of glass overlooking the city, Alexander Whitmore studied the interview schedule on his tablet. At 39, he had built Whitmore Global into one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. People described him as brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to impress. He had interviewed hundreds of candidates over the years. Most came prepared to tell him what they wanted him to hear. But today, something unexpected caught his attention. A name on the list. Emily Carter. Her resume was not the most decorated. It was not the most polished. Yet there was something about the way her experience was written. It showed someone who had faced pressure and continued forward. Alexander looked out at the city below, unaware that in just a few minutes, a woman waiting quietly outside his office would challenge everything he thought he knew about success. The conference room door opened. "Emily Carter," a staff member called. She stood, took one steady breath, and walked forward. She did not know the man waiting inside was the CEO himself. She did not know this interview would become the moment that changed 2 lives forever. She only knew one thing. She had come too far to walk away now. Emily stepped into conference room B, unaware that the man sitting at the end of the long glass table was not another executive. He was Alexander Whitmore, the person whose name appeared on every building sign, every business article, and every financial report connected to Whitmore Global. The room became strangely quiet as she entered. 6 people looked up from their notes, but Alexander was the only one who did not immediately look at her resume. He looked at her. "Please have a seat," he said calmly. Emily sat down, placing her folder carefully on the table. She noticed the expensive surroundings, the city skyline behind the glass walls, and the confidence of everyone around her. For a brief second, she felt the familiar feeling of being out of place. But then she remembered the early mornings, the long commutes, and every moment when she had almost given up but chose to continue. Emily Carter, Alexander said, glancing at the page in front of him. Your background is interesting. She waited. She had heard that sentence before. Sometimes it meant curiosity. Sometimes it meant rejection was coming next. You have strong academic results, but there is a gap of several years in your professional history. Can you explain that? The question was direct but not unkind. Emily folded her hands together and answered honestly. I had responsibilities that changed my path. I stepped away from the career I planned, but I never stopped learning. One of the interviewers looked down at her notes. Many candidates use that time to advance their careers. How did you stay competitive? Emily looked toward the woman and smiled softly. I learned different skills. Patience. Problem solving. Staying calm when things do not go according to plan. Those skills are not always listed on a resume, but they matter. Alexander watched her carefully. Most candidates tried to impress him with achievements, awards, and impressive titles. Emily did something different. She spoke about lessons, not excuses. The interview continued. They asked about business strategies, teamwork, and difficult decisions. Emily answered with confidence, but never pretended to know everything. When she did not have an answer, she admitted it and explained how she would find one. Alexander noticed something unusual. She was not trying to become someone else to get the job. She was simply showing who she was. After nearly 30 minutes, one interviewer closed the folder. Thank you, Miss Carter. We will contact you soon. Emily nodded politely and stood. She gathered her papers, believing the meeting was over. Before she reached the door, Alexander spoke. Emily. She turned around. Yes. He looked at the resume again, then back at her. Why did you apply for this position? It was a simple question, but something about the way he asked made her pause. She could have given the expected answer. She could have talked about ambition, salary, or career growth. Instead, she told the truth. Because I know what it feels like when people only see what you have lost instead of what you can still become. For the first time that morning, Alexander had no immediate response. The room remained silent. Emily thanked them and walked out, unaware that a single sentence had just made the most powerful man in the company reconsider everything he believed about potential. She thought she had simply completed an interview. Alexander knew he had just met someone impossible to ignore. The next morning, the rain had disappeared, but Emily Carter still felt the weight of uncertainty sitting on her shoulders. She stood outside a small coffee shop near her apartment, holding a paper cup between both hands while watching people rush through the streets of Manhattan. For most of them, the day was beginning normally. For Emily, everything depended on one phone call. She had attended countless interviews before. She knew the pattern. Polite conversation, a hopeful smile, then a carefully written message saying they decided to move forward with another candidate. She had learned not to expect too much. Hope was something she protected carefully because disappointment was expensive. Her phone vibrated on the table. Emily looked at the screen and froze. The message was from Whitmore Global. Her heart began beating faster. She opened it slowly. Miss Carter, we would like to invite you back for a second interview. She read the sentence twice. A small smile appeared on her face before she could stop it. It was not a job offer yet. It was only another step. But after everything she had faced, another step felt like a victory. Across town, Alexander Whitmore stood inside his office, looking over the same message on his computer screen. His assistant, Claire Bennett, placed a folder on his desk. I have prepared the finalists for the position, she said. Alexander glanced at the folder but did not open it. Remove Emily Carter from the standard list. Claire looked surprised. Remove her. Move her to the executive project interview. The executive project? Claire asked carefully. That position has not been offered to anyone yet. Alexander looked through the glass wall at the city below. I know. Claire had worked with Alexander for 7 years. She had seen him make decisions involving millions of dollars without hesitation. She had seen him analyze companies, markets, and investments with incredible precision. But this was different. He was interested in a person, not a number. What makes her different? Claire asked. Alexander looked down at Emily's resume again. Most people tell me what they have achieved. She told me what she learned when things did not go as planned. He paused. That is rare. Later that afternoon, Emily returned to Whitmore Global. This time she walked through the lobby with a little more confidence. She still noticed the marble floors, the expensive suits, and the powerful people moving around her. But she no longer felt like she was trespassing in someone else's world. She had earned the right to be there. When she entered the conference room, Alexander was waiting alone. The absence of the other interviewers surprised her. Please sit down, he said. Emily took the chair across from him. For the first few minutes, the conversation felt different. It was less like an interview and more like a discussion. Alexander asked about her decisions, her approach to challenges, and the way she worked with people. Emily answered honestly. I believe people do their best when they feel respected, she said. A company can have the best technology in the world, but if the people behind it feel invisible, eventually the company loses something important. Alexander remained quiet for a moment. Those words stayed with him because they touched something he rarely considered. For years he had measured success through growth charts, quarterly results, and business achievements. But Emily was talking about something harder to measure. Trust, loyalty, human connection. As the interview ended, Emily stood and thanked him. She expected nothing more. She had learned not to assume kindness meant opportunity. But as she reached the door, Alexander spoke again. Emily. She turned around. Yes. If you were given the chance to change one thing about a company like ours, what would it be? Emily thought carefully. Then she answered. I would make sure the people who work hardest are not the people who are seen the least. Alexander watched her leave. The room became quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Because for the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore was not thinking about how to build a bigger company. He was thinking about the kind of company he wanted to build. The morning sun reflected across the glass walls of Whitmore Global, but inside the executive floor, a quiet tension filled the conference room. Emily Carter sat at the end of the table, looking at the project documents in front of her. This was no longer a simple interview. Alexander Whitmore had given her a chance to prove herself, and now she was facing the first real challenge. Around the table were senior managers who had spent years building their careers inside the company. Emily knew she was the newest person in the room. She knew some of them were wondering why Alexander had chosen someone with a less traditional background. But she also knew something else. She had spent years solving problems without having perfect resources. That experience mattered. The project deadline is 6 weeks, one executive explained. We need a strategy that improves customer satisfaction while reducing unnecessary costs. Several people immediately began discussing numbers and projections. Emily listened carefully. She did not rush to speak. She watched the way people talked over each other, the way some ideas were ignored before they were fully explained. Alexander noticed her silence. You have been quiet for a while, he said. What are you thinking? Emily looked around the room. I think we are asking the wrong question. The room became still. Few executives exchanged surprised looks. Alexander leaned slightly forward. What do you mean? Emily opened the folder in front of her. Everyone is asking how to make the company more efficient. But before that, we should ask why customers are feeling disconnected. She pointed to the reports. Numbers show what happened. They do not always explain why it happened. Alexander studied her expression. She was not trying to challenge anyone. She was trying to understand the problem differently. Continue, he said. Emily explained that the company had focused heavily on technology improvements, but had overlooked the human experience behind those services. She suggested speaking directly with customers and employees before making major decisions. Some people in the room were skeptical. They were used to strategies built from spreadsheets and forecasts. But Alexander asked one question that surprised everyone. How long would it take to test this approach? 2 weeks, Emily answered. And what would you need? A small team, honest feedback, and permission to listen before making decisions. For a moment Alexander said nothing. Then he nodded. Do it. After the meeting ended, Emily gathered her papers and prepared to leave. She expected the usual challenges. She expected people to question her. What she did not expect was Alexander waiting near the doorway. You were not nervous in there, he said. Emily smiled slightly. I was nervous. You did not look nervous. She looked down at her folder. I learned a long time ago that being afraid does not mean you stop moving forward. Those words stayed with Alexander. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted to appear powerful. Emily was different. She did not pretend to have all the answers. She simply had the courage to search for better ones. As Emily walked away, Alexander looked through the conference room window at the city below. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Curiosity. Not about a business opportunity, not about a financial result, but about a person who had entered his world carrying very little, yet somehow brought a perspective that money could never buy. 2 weeks after Emily Carter joined Whitmore Global, something unexpected happened. The people who once questioned why Alexander Whitmore had chosen her were now quietly watching her results. The small customer research project she created had revealed details that traditional reports had missed. Customers did not simply want faster service. They wanted to feel understood. Employees did not simply want better systems. They wanted to know their voices mattered. Emily had not changed the company overnight. She had simply reminded people to look closer. But not everyone was impressed. Inside the executive floor, some leaders believed Alexander was giving too much attention to someone who had not followed the usual path. During a private meeting, one senior manager placed a report on the table. The approach is interesting, but we need to be careful, he said. Whitmore Global was built on proven methods. We cannot make major decisions based on emotions. Alexander looked at the report without responding immediately. Years ago, he would have agreed without hesitation. Numbers were clear. Numbers were safe. But lately, he found himself remembering Emily's words. Numbers showed what happened. They did not always explain why. The results are stronger than expected, Alexander finally said. The manager nodded. Yes, but she is still new. Alexander looked up. Everyone was new once. The conversation ended there. But Alexander knew something important had changed. He was defending an idea he would have ignored before. Later that afternoon, Emily sat at her desk reviewing notes from the project. She was still adjusting to the environment around her. The offices were impressive. The technology was advanced. The expectations were high. But what surprised her most was Alexander himself. The man everyone described as impossible to impress was not what she expected. He listened more than people realized. He simply had spent years hiding it behind a professional image. As Emily prepared to leave for the day, she noticed a message waiting on her computer. It was from Alexander. Can you join me for a conversation before you leave? She walked toward his office, wondering if she had made a mistake. When she entered, Alexander was standing near the window, holding a document. Your project has changed how several departments think about customer relationships, he said. Emily smiled. I am glad it helped. Alexander handed her the document. I want you to lead the next phase. Emily looked surprised. Are you sure? There are people here with more experience than me. Alexander studied her for a moment. Experience matters. But perspective matters too. Emily looked down at the document, then back at him. Why do you trust me with this? It was a simple question, but Alexander took a moment before answering. Because when everyone else focused on what the company could gain, you focused on what people needed. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the office, the city continued moving. Cars passed through crowded streets. People hurried toward their next destination. But inside that quiet room, something different was happening. Alexander Whitmore, a man who had spent years building success through control and certainty, was learning to value something he could not measure on a spreadsheet. And Emily Carter, a woman who once wondered if she belonged in that building, was beginning to realize she was not there by accident. She was there because she had something no title, connection, or amount of money could replace. A genuine understanding of people. What neither of them knew was that the biggest challenge was still ahead, and it would reveal exactly what kind of person each of them truly was. The following weeks brought a quiet change inside Whitmore Global. It was not the kind of change that appeared in headlines or business reports. It happened in small moments. A manager who once ignored employee suggestions started asking for opinions. A department that rarely communicated with customers began listening to their concerns. And at the center of it all was Emily Carter, the woman who had entered the company with a simple folder and a determination to prove herself. But success inside a powerful company was never simple. Emily soon discovered that creating change meant challenging people who were comfortable with the way things had always been done. One afternoon, she walked into a meeting where several executives were reviewing the next stage of the company's expansion plan. The presentation was filled with impressive numbers and ambitious goals. Everyone seemed confident. Everyone except Emily. She looked at the information on the screen and noticed something that others had overlooked. "There is a problem with this approach," she said quietly. The room became silent. A few people turned toward her with surprise. One executive leaned back in his chair. "A problem?" he asked. "The projections show strong growth." Emily nodded. "The projections show growth, but they do not show the people affected by those decisions." She explained that the company was preparing to launch a major update without fully understanding how some customers would experience the changes. It was not a failure in technology. It was a failure in connection. Some people in the room disagreed. They believed business decisions should be based on efficiency and results. Emily understood their perspective. But she also understood something they had forgotten. Behind every number was a person. Alexander Whitmore sat quietly at the end of the table, watching the conversation unfold. He noticed that Emily was not trying to prove she was smarter than anyone else. She was simply willing to say what others were afraid to say. After the meeting ended, several executives left quickly. Emily stayed behind to organize her notes. Alexander approached her. "You knew people would disagree with you," he said. Emily looked up. "Yes. And you still said it." She gave a small smile. "If I only speak when everyone agrees with me, then I am not really helping." Alexander looked at her for a moment. Those words stayed with him. For years, people around him had agreed because of his position. They respected his authority, but few challenged his thinking. Emily was different. She respected him, but she was not afraid of him. Later that evening, Alexander remained in his office long after most employees had left. The city lights reflected against the glass windows. He looked at the reports on his desk, then at the notes from Emily's project. He realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years building a company that measured everything except the things that mattered most. Trust, loyalty, human connection. Meanwhile, Emily walked through the quiet streets toward her apartment, unaware that her simple honesty had affected the most powerful person in the building. She believed she was only doing her job. But Alexander was beginning to understand that Emily was not changing the company because she had power. She was changing it because she reminded everyone what power was supposed to protect. The morning after the executive meeting, Emily Carter arrived at Whitmore Global earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, with the streets below filled with morning traffic and the sound of footsteps moving toward another busy day. She carried a small notebook filled with ideas, observations, and reminders. To everyone else, it was just a notebook. To Emily, it represented every lesson she had learned while rebuilding her life one step at a time. But when she reached her desk, she noticed something unusual. Several employees were gathered near the break room, speaking quietly. Their expressions showed concern. Emily walked closer and discovered that a group of employees from one department was facing a difficult situation. A new company policy had created confusion, and many people felt their concerns were not being heard. The issue was not large enough to appear in financial reports, but it was important to the people experiencing it every day. Emily listened carefully. She did not promise impossible solutions. She did not pretend to have authority she did not have. She simply told them she would bring their concerns forward. Later that afternoon, Emily entered Alexander Whitmore's office with a folder in her hands. "There is something you need to see," she said. Alexander looked up from his desk. "Another challenge?" he asked with a slight smile. Emily placed the folder in front of him. "A concern from the people who keep this company running." Alexander opened it and read through the information. For a moment his expression changed. He realized this was not just about a policy, it was about communication. "Why did nobody bring this to me before?" he asked. Emily answered honestly, Because sometimes people assume leaders are too busy to listen. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Alexander looked out the window. He had spent years making himself available for major decisions. He attended meetings. He reviewed reports. He solved complex problems. Yet somehow, the voices closest to the daily work had become distant. "What would you do?" he asked. Emily thought for a moment. "I would create a way for people to speak before problems become bigger." Alexander nodded slowly. That evening, Alexander stayed late again. But this time he was not reviewing market predictions or expansion plans. He was reading employee feedback. Page after page revealed stories he had never seen. Not complaints. Not criticism. Just people wanting to feel valued. Meanwhile, Emily returned home to her small apartment. She placed her notebook on the kitchen table and looked at the message waiting on her phone from her child's school about an upcoming event. For a moment she smiled. Her life was still full of responsibilities. She was still balancing work and personal commitments. But something felt different. She no longer felt invisible. The next morning, Alexander made an announcement to the leadership team. He introduced a new employee communication program designed to make sure every voice had a chance to be heard. Some executives were surprised. Others questioned whether it was necessary. But Alexander remained calm. "A company is not built only by the people in this room," he said. "It is built by everyone who shows up every day." Emily listened from the back of the room. She never expected her words to influence someone like Alexander Whitmore. She never expected the person with the most power in the building to become the person most willing to learn. But Alexander was beginning to understand something Emily had known all along. Success was not measured only by what you built. It was measured by who you remembered along the way. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore left his office before sunset. It was a small decision, something most people would never notice, but for Alexander it represented a change he had not expected. He had spent so much of his life believing that success meant always being the last person in the building, the one who carried every responsibility, the one who never slowed down. But lately he had started asking a different question. What was the point of building everything if he never had time to truly experience it? Across the city, Emily Carter was finishing her final notes for the week when she received a message from Alexander. "I would like your opinion on something." She smiled slightly. Months ago, she never imagined the CEO of Whitmore Global would ask for her thoughts outside of a formal meeting. She walked to his office, carrying her notebook as usual. Alexander was standing near the window, but this time the room felt different. It did not feel like a place where decisions were made. It felt like a place where someone was thinking. "I have been reviewing the changes we made," Alexander said. "The results are better than expected." Emily nodded. "That is good news." He looked at her. "But I do not think the numbers are the most important part." Emily was surprised. Those were not the words she expected from him. Alexander continued. "Before you came here, I thought leadership was about having the right answers. Now I think it is also about asking the right questions." Emily placed her notebook on the table. "That is a big change." Alexander smiled faintly. "I know." For a moment, the powerful CEO who had appeared so confident in every business article seemed different. Not weaker, just more human. He told Emily about the years he spent building Whitmore Global. The long days, the constant pressure, the decisions that affected thousands of people. He had achieved everything people said he should want. A successful company, financial security, a respected name. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how important simple connections could be. "People think having everything means you have nothing left to learn," Alexander said quietly. "They are wrong." Emily listened. She understood that feeling more than he knew. Her own journey had taught her that losing one version of your life did not mean you lost your value. Sometimes it simply meant you had to discover a different kind of strength. "You know," Emily said, "sometimes the hardest lessons come from places we never expected to find them." Alexander looked at her and smiled. "Like a job interview?" Emily laughed softly. "Exactly." The conversation continued longer than either of them expected. They discussed ideas, challenges, and the future of the company. But what mattered most was not the business strategy. It was the understanding growing between two people from completely different worlds. The next day, Alexander made another surprising decision. He asked Emily to lead a company initiative focused on creating stronger connections between leadership and employees. Some people questioned why he trusted someone who had joined the company only months earlier. Alexander had a simple answer. Because she reminds us what we are building for. When Emily heard those words, she looked down at the small notebook she always carried. The same notebook she brought to her first interview. Back then, she only hoped someone would give her a chance. Now she was helping shape the future of a company she once thought was beyond her reach. And Alexander Whitmore finally understood the truth he had spent years searching for. The greatest success in life was not measured by how high you could climb. It was measured by whether you remembered the people who helped you become who you were meant to be. 1 year after Emily Carter first walked into Whitmore Global, the same glass doors that once made her feel like an outsider now opened into a place she helped transform. The marble lobby was still the same. The city skyline was still the same. But Emily was different. She no longer entered the building wondering if she belonged. She walked through it knowing that she had earned her place. The company had changed too. Employees who once felt invisible were now part of important conversations. Leaders who once focused only on results had learned to listen. And at the center of that transformation was a lesson Alexander Whitmore never expected to learn. The company was not built only by strategies and numbers. It was built by people. On a quiet afternoon, Emily sat in the same conference room where she had once nervously answered questions during her first interview. This time she was leading a meeting. The table that once represented a world she thought was beyond her reach had become a place where her voice mattered. After the meeting ended, Alexander stayed behind. He looked around the room and smiled. "Do you remember your first day here?" he asked. Emily laughed softly. "I remember thinking I was probably the least qualified person in the building." Alexander shook his head. "You were the person who reminded everyone else why they were here." Emily looked out the window at the city below. A year earlier, she had arrived carrying only a resume, a few hopes, and the determination to create a better future. She never imagined that a single conversation could change the direction of her life. Alexander walked toward the table and placed a familiar folder in front of her. Emily recognized it immediately. Her original resume. The same one she had brought to her first interview. "You kept it?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "I keep it as a reminder." "Of what?" she asked. He looked at the paper for a moment before answering. "That sometimes the person with the most potential is the person everyone else overlooks." Emily smiled. She thought about the version of herself who stood in that lobby, nervous and uncertain. She wished she could tell that woman one thing. That being underestimated did not mean being unworthy. That difficult seasons did not define the entire story. That one opportunity could appear when you least expected it. Later that evening, Alexander stood by the same office window where he had spent countless nights working alone. But the room no longer felt empty. His company was stronger. His relationships were deeper. And his perspective had completely changed. Emily had entered his life looking for a job. Instead, she brought something far more valuable. A reminder that success without compassion was incomplete. Before leaving the office, Alexander looked at the city lights and thought about the moment. Everything changed. It was not a major business decision. It was not a record-breaking achievement. It was a simple interview with someone who refused to let her circumstances decide her worth. Emily Carter believed she was searching for a chance. Alexander Whitmore believed he was offering one. But in the end, they both discovered the same truth. Sometimes the person you think you are helping is the person who helps you find your way back to what truly matters. Because he had built an empire with money, but she reminded him how to build a life with meaning.